been here.
Well, it's a privilege, and this is a topic that we've been in the consortium concerned with for some little time because it's become apparent that there are a whole series of climate-related environmental health threats that are difficult to perceive if you're living in a community. Many of them involve food and water. Some of them involve other aspects of communities like permafrost. And we'll talk about a few of these things. We won't talk about all of them because of the problems with time, but I think there'll be some time for questions at the end. Is that correct, Steve? Yeah, that's the plan anyway. I'll talk fast. All right, the population of Alaskan natives is now it's about 143,000. The slide is a little outdated. That is the largest percent of any state's population that are Native American. There are states with larger Native American populations, but the percent of the population is larger in Alaska than anywhere else. And roughly 60% of that population lives in extremely rural environments. Many of you in the room probably already know that, so I'm not going to belabor that point. It's a young population. As you can see, the median age is in the low 20s. Around roughly somewhere around two-thirds, between 60% and two-thirds live in very small communities, what we would consider in the lower 48 very small communities. And there are around 200 rural communities, most of which have no road connection with any hub community. So this is my construct of the environmental health threats that face Alaskan natives today. And actually they aren't unique to Alaskan natives. Anywhere in the circumpolar north and lots of other parts of the world, you can see the same factors, the same environmental variables. Anthropogenic contaminants, most of which are from the lower latitudes and are transported by atmospheric and oceanic transport mechanisms to the north because of the Coriolis effect in the atmosphere and because of the differential heating between the equator and the poles. They're deposited here and they're slow to leave. Then the other issue is the trend in the last 50 years in Alaska for the climate to be warming. And those two interact, and where they interact and overlap, the Venn diagram is labeled food and water security. And those are the major health threats that are not related to rapid cultural change, which is a big overlapping factor. So we'll talk about contaminant transport and the effect on subsistence food. We'll talk about zoonotic diseases. That term means an animal disease that's transmissible to humans. Rabies is probably the poster child. Damage to permafrost, unintentional injury, and extreme events. And the last two we won't spend much time on just because today's topic is about the first three. So the context we use for food and water security is the threat to village water supplies and subsistence animals, because Alaskan natives are the U.S.'s most subsistence-dependent population. And there are many villages that economically could not replace their subsistence diet calories with Western foods bought at prices that exist in most of the communities. So in real time, they're dependent in a way that most of the rest of us are not on subsistence foods. Nobody inspects these. Whatever happens to them, you have to put up with it. So the crux of this is subsistence food threats are rarely visible when you harvest the animal and rarely can be tasted when you eat it. And for that reason, we have to look at a whole new way for communities to evaluate the threats around them. So we biomonitor a lot of different things in Alaska. The Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium has two major biomonitoring programs. We have what we call the Maternal Organics Monitoring Program that looks at maternal blood. for contaminants of anthropogenic origin. We're not going to talk much about that today. And then we have the RAMP program, the Rural Alaska Monitoring Program, which is where we're going to spend our time. This is just to remind you that the change in temperature in Alaska varies as a gradient, sort of from the Alaska Peninsula in the southwest corner there to the Arctic slope in a least to most fashion. You can't read the numbers very well, but there in northwest Alaska, there's been a considerable warming trend over the last 4 or 5 decades. Now, the air temperature in Alaska, south of the Brooks Range, has quit warming over the last decade. And this is an isoplete diagram that shows the decrease in surface air temperature over the last decade. And you can see the black line where there's zero change is the Brooks Range. It's still warming, there are red lines, north in the Arctic slope, and it's cooled significantly to the south. It's nowhere near where it was, but for the moment, things are going in the other direction, south of the Brooks Range. Doesn't make any difference to the problems we're seeing because most of them are now established. This is to remind people that the Alaskan Native population has a huge subsistence harvest. The blue is marine fish, gray are marine mammals, and you can see that the calibration on the side, the units are kilograms per capita per year. So these are huge harvests of subsistence food. The world ocean circulations are such that if you look at the Pacific, there's a constant delivery of current delivered anthropogenic contaminants that sweeps up the western side of the Pacific Basin, crosses the Pacific just south of the Aleutian Chain. Lots of water passes through the passes into the Bering Sea, and it's a one-way flow from the Bering Sea into the Arctic Ocean. And then 85% of that water that passes through the Bering Strait goes east through the Canadian archipelago into the Labrador Sea. This is a look at the range summer in gray, winter in black of the 5 species of Pacific salmon that spawn in the Yukon and Kuskokwim River. They're right in that western boundary current. And this is what they get from it. It's hard to read these, the names of these contaminants, but in fact, these levels are low enough so that even the highest one there, which is toxaphene on the extreme left, would not prevent their sale in a market. So these are clean fish compared to fish in lots of other places. And over on the far right is the perfluorinated compounds, the Teflon-like compounds. They are rising, and they are one of those things that we find in subsistence food. Now this is just a quick look at what we found in the mothers who eat the salmon and the sea mammals that feed on those salmon we looked at. And just to make it easy, way over on the left side, the red and blue bars are about the same height as the countries in the middle that are Scandinavian: Iceland, Norway, Greenland, and Denmark. And Russia, they're right next to the Alaskan natives. The second one in from the right has far higher levels, as do the Greenland Inuit, which are second in from the left. So Alaska natives are about in the same spot as high marine diet intake Scandinavian women and the Arctic Canadian Inuit in the western Canadian Arctic. And this is a scatter plot just to show you that in fact the benefit package, the omega-3 fatty acids, track in a linear fashion with mercury. Mercury is a biomarker for omega-3 fatty acid intake in this population. So the RAMP program is a biomonitoring program where villages are assessed, their biggest threats are identified, metrics are developed that watch those threats, and we're going to talk about those metrics here in just a moment. So the examples of some of these environmental metrics would be permafrost temperatures to look at the stability of the water source, shoreline cameras in village whose source water is a river, which tends to erode their village site, the bivalves that people harvest, clams, mussels, and saxitoxin, which we think is moving north because of the movement of the Alexandrian plankton that carries it. We're going to be looking at zoonotic antibody levels in the species that are harvested by the hunters. They'll test that themselves. And we'll do the same thing with organohalogens in blood from these animals. This is a lake that's disappeared at tundra water sources. Percolated away because the permafrost at the bottom of the lake has melted and it no longer contains the water. Same thing has happened here, but only to half the little ponds in the picture you can see here, because the other half have a gravel bottom and it's a little better at retaining permafrost temperatures. And here's a gentleman who's installed a trail camera to monitor shoreline activity, shoreline loss. And this is a huge thermokarst slump, one of the biggest we've seen on the Selawik River. It's bigger than that now. This is an older picture. But it's turned the river into a turbid stream from being a clear stream, and it's really made difficulty for the water extraction and treatment plant down in the village of Selawik, just downriver. This is a stand of willow that's higher than my head. It wasn't very long ago that willow never got much higher than your knee, but now the tree line has moved north, and this guy's moved with it and brought new zoonotic diseases that we'll describe briefly in a minute. This is a cyanobacterial bloom in the Chukchi Sea estuary not too far from Kotzebue, and it's one of the first anybody's ever seen. It's right now what's limiting the water intake for the city of Toledo from Lake Erie. Lake Erie's got a huge bloom. It puts out a microcystin toxin that the water treatment system does not remove, and you can't drink the water. So this can concentrate in fish, in clams, and it is one of the things we're going to be measuring. Here's what the village of King Cove found when they did 2 years worth of study on saxitoxin, paralytic shellfish poisoning toxin, in the clams on their beach. It's way over the limit. Most of the time it's slightly over the limit. That's the red line you can see there. But they've found now that they can predict which months it'll be a problem. So multiple interactions are another big problem. Tissue levels of contaminants in the subsistence animals impairs their immune response, and they're much more likely to activate a zoonotic disease that they weren't having any trouble with. And that animal's likely to be slower, likely to be harvested, and more likely to expose the consumer to the disease it has. So this is one of those issues where the climate change increases contaminant transport. The animals are exposed to new zoonotic diseases, and so are the consumers that eat them. This is a picture that was taken in Anchorage, and it's a good example of how domestic animals can be responsible for transmitting an organism like toxoplasmosis, the one we warn pregnant women about when they're pregnant, to not empty a litter box, to the cat there. And that's happened in Anchorage. We had a baby that was in the paper because it was born with toxoplasma and it wasn't picked up for a little while. So these are the currently active zoonotic diseases in particularly the sea mammals in the Bering Sea region and sometimes in the caribou. And we use this data in a variety of ways, but the most important way we use it is for the village to develop their own adaptation strategy so they can reduce their own risks to their subsistence diet and still continue to eat it. And that involves a whole lot of thought and prioritization on the part of a village council and the residents in what they think is most important and who's most vulnerable to these new risks. And the whole point is to keep this guy hunting and the folks back in the village eating what he shoots. And I'll quit because I'm sure I'm a little over my 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jim.